as well as the traditions and the atmosphere that come with it. But equally, Cheltenham has a lot to offer. A crisis was quietly blooming behind gilded doors, one that could have rewritten young Princess Charlotte's royal future. Whispers of manipulation, carefully staged moments, and Camilla's cunning plan to trap the spirited girl in a public disaster were gaining momentum. But before it could explode into scandal, Princess Anne stepped in, calm, sharp, and fiercely protective. With quiet urgency, she followed the clues, challenged the shadows, and shielded her great niece from a storm no child should face. Was this just loyalty or a silent act of rebellion from within the crown? The Silent Shield. Within the regal halls of Buckingham Palace, where golden chandeliers hang like frozen stars and silence often speaks louder than words, an unsettling story lay buried in ink and secrecy. It didn't come from a press release or public statement. No, it was written in looping handwriting, on pages slightly yellowed by time, tucked away inside a locked drawer labeled simply personal. The author, Princess Anne, but the subject wasn't herself or even her brother, the king. It was Charlotte. According to this hidden diary, something troubling was set in motion in March 2025, weeks before a major palace charity event scheduled to take place at the Royal Opera House in London. It was to be a milestone moment for 9-year-old Princess Charlotte, a carefully chosen appearance crafted to help the public warm up to the young royal, showcasing her intelligence, charm, and natural poise. For the first time, she would deliver a brief message, written with the help of her tutors, meant to show the world a glimpse of the future queen she may one day become. But behind that charming photo op, something darker was brewing. Princess Anne had sensed it first, just a ripple at first, when she overheard 2 aides murmuring near the Queen's gallery. Their words were vague, but something felt off. "Make it unforgettable," one said. "In the right kind of wrong way," the other replied, chuckling. Anne brushed it off at the time, but then the changes started. First, the script Charlotte had worked so hard on was quietly edited. Key phrases, ones she had practiced for weeks, were replaced with awkward wording and complex vocabulary not suited to her age. Then came a last-minute shift in stage arrangements. The lights were angled differently, casting unexpected shadows across the podium. The entry route to the stage, once straightforward, was suddenly rerouted to include a confusing detour through a backstage corridor. To an adult, these might seem like minor hiccups, but to a child, one standing before global cameras, it could have been a disaster. As Anne pieced together the changes, her diary entries took on a new urgency. One sentence stood out sharply in her familiar script. "They're setting her up to fall, not physically, but in the court of public opinion." But who were they? As Anne dug deeper in quiet observation, a name rose to the surface more than once. Camilla, the queen consort, had kept her distance from Charlotte publicly. But Anne had long suspected there were private tensions hidden under those carefully staged smiles. Why Camilla would want to see the young princess falter was unclear. Jealousy, control, or an old grudge hidden behind a crown. Whatever the motive, Anne refused to sit idly by. She didn't alert Charles or even William. Too many voices would muddy the truth. She had seen how rumors twist and how quickly a scandal can snowball. Instead, she chose quiet action in her pen. "This ends with me," she wrote, and from that moment forward, Princess Anne decided she wouldn't just witness history. She would quietly, fiercely change it. Now, what made Anne risk everything in silence? Power, loyalty, or fear of the crown's collapse? Stay tuned to find out. Betrayal in the shadows of the crown. As the days inched closer to the royal gala set for March 2025, at the Royal Opera House, Princess Anne found herself entangled in something far darker than protocol or preparation. What began as a subtle unease had grown into full-blown betrayal, and this time, it wasn't distant politics or tabloid nonsense. This time, it was Charlotte. Anne's diary, once filled with cool observations, began to shift in tone, becoming raw, personal, and heavy with heartbreak. For over 7 decades, Anne had served the crown with unmatched discipline. She stayed out of palace squabbles, avoided drama, and never cared for flashing cameras. But now she was watching familiar faces, the ones she trusted, move like ghosts behind Charlotte's moment in the spotlight. What she uncovered felt more like treason than strategy. The names scribbled into her diary weren't strangers. They were seasoned aides and royal coordinators, people she'd shared banquets and briefings with. And yet, they were rewriting Charlotte's speech behind her back, inserting phrases too long, too complex, or just strange. Audio cues were shifted by seconds. The walk to the stage was rerouted again, not by accident, but by design. It wasn't designed to break Charlotte. It was meant to shake her, confuse her, just enough for the public to notice. Just enough to leave a bruise on her reputation. This isn't about fixing mistakes, Anne wrote in one tight, furious entry. It's about planting them. And at the heart of it all, one name kept resurfacing in whispers and sideways glances. Camilla. Though Anne had no proof that Camilla gave direct orders, the pattern was clear. The people involved answered only to her. Camilla, the queen consort, had kept her hands clean, but her influence dripped across every suspicious detail. And for Anne, that was more than enough. The betrayal cut deeper, knowing it was aimed at Charlotte, a bright, confident child, already learning to navigate the storm of royal expectation. Anne knew how cruel that world could be. The king was consumed with state visits. William was abroad, handling diplomatic talks. Camilla, too well protected by layers of politics and polished press statements. That left Anne and Anne alone. So, the night before Charlotte's final rehearsal, she stopped watching. She acted. Long after the corridors emptied and the palace had fallen into stillness, Anne walked alone down to the office of the senior aide responsible for event logistics. She had already checked the schedules twice that day, circled anomalies, and flagged last-minute changes. But now, she wanted the truth in hand. Inside the office, her fears were confirmed. On the desk sat a marked-up copy of Charlotte's final speech, littered with handwritten notes designed to trip her up. Next to it, a stage map. Charlotte's cues shifted again, just enough to cause hesitation under the lights. Anne didn't hide. When the aide returned, his eyes met hers and dropped. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held out the papers and asked calmly, "Tell me this was a mistake." But Anne had seen too many palace games to mistake fear for innocence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a setup, and it was aimed at the youngest Windsor on the rise. So, how did Anne expose a royal setup without saying a word? Keep watching. What she uncovered changes everything. Princess Anne reclaims Charlotte's moment. Princess Anne didn't seek revenge. That wasn't her way. What she wanted, what she needed, was to put things right. After discovering the planned sabotage hidden inside speech drafts, lighting instructions, and altered event notes, she acted, not with fury, but with quiet control. In the early hours of March 2020, just one day before the royal gala, she slipped back into her quarters, the incriminating documents tucked under her arm. Her diary that night ended with a single line. "It ends now, not tomorrow, now." She didn't waste time. By morning, Anne was already at work. There were no heated meetings, no royal summons, and certainly no drama. She simply picked up the phone and made 3 private calls. Within hours, 2 event staffers were quietly reassigned. In their place, Anne brought in seasoned professionals she trusted, individuals who had once served alongside her during high-stakes Commonwealth tours. There were no questions asked. Her name alone was enough. Anne's power didn't rely on volume. It was in her posture, her gaze, her legacy. She walked the gala stage herself later that afternoon, under the golden lights of the Royal Opera House. Step by step, she counted the spacing from podium to curtain, checked the glare of every spotlight, and stood exactly where Charlotte would stand. Nothing was left to chance. Anne even requested a private word with the sound technician, calmly reminding him that any unexpected microphone glitch would be dealt with personally. In her journal, she called the effort precision protection. Princess Charlotte arrived later for rehearsal, unaware of how close her moment had come to disaster. Dressed in pale blue with her speech clutched in her hand, she looked every bit the future monarch the public adored. Bright-eyed, focused, and wonderfully unaware of the sabotage that had nearly stolen her moment. She greeted her great aunt with her usual cheerful hug, and Anne smiled, keeping her secret behind steady eyes. From behind the curtain, Anne watched as Charlotte practiced. The speech was back to its original form, clear, warm, and simple enough to let Charlotte's natural confidence shine through. There were no strange words, no awkward pacing. She hit every mark. She didn't falter once. The trap had been dismantled without her ever knowing it. Anne's diary that night held no celebration, only reflection. The words were hers. The silence, what almost happened, that belongs to me. On the night of March 2025, the gala crowd rose to their feet in applause as Princess Charlotte finished her speech with grace far beyond her years. The press called it flawless. Headlines the next morning praised her poise, her future, her royal charm. No one knew how close it had come to crumbling. And that was the point. Anne remained in the shadows, watching from backstage, her arms crossed and eyes steady. She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. Her work was done, and not a soul knew what she had just saved, except the one who had tried to destroy it. And how did Princess Charlotte's perfect moment nearly collapse before it began? Stay with us. What happened behind the curtain will shock you. Anne's silent gift to Charlotte. The sun rose gently over Buckingham Palace in March 2025, and life moved on as though nothing had shifted. A new day, another headline praising the young Princess Charlotte for her poised debut at the Royal Gala. Smiles were exchanged in passing, staff resumed their routines, and no one, except one, knew how close the previous night had come to collapse. Princess Anne carried on just as the palace had taught her. Composure first, questions later, if ever. But inside her private quarters, tucked behind heavy oak doors, she knew the truth. She had faced betrayal and crushed it before it ever reached the light. No medals, no applause, only a closed journal and a single, quiet vow. Let her remember the night as her own. Let me remember it for what it almost became. And as for William, he remained entirely in the dark. And that wasn't by accident. Anne's diary entries in the weeks leading up to the event were detailed, methodical, and deliberate. But not once did Prince William's name appear. Not once did she confide in him, because, while she respected him deeply, respected his loyalty to his daughter, his duty to the crown, she knew his heart too well. The moment he sensed danger, he would have acted. The moment he heard the word sabotage, he would have stormed into the corridors of power, demanding answers, and that storm would have dragged the whole family into chaos. Anne feared the consequences, not just for William, but for Charlotte. William wasn't just Charlotte's father. He was the heir to the throne. Every move he made echoed. And if he had stepped into the plot, even with the best intentions, the outcome would have shifted entirely. The trap would no longer be a whisper of mischief hidden behind curtains. It would explode into scandal, headlines, and division within the royal household. That was not a weight Anne was willing to risk placing on his shoulders. She wrote about one moment in particular. It was after the speech, the applause still echoing from the grand walls of the Royal Opera House. William had called his daughter, his voice filled with warmth and admiration. "You were born for this," he told her. Charlotte's eyes lit up. She believed him. Anne had been in the room, silent, still, and unnoticed. She didn't speak. She didn't dare. That moment, untouched by politics or suspicion, was exactly what she had fought to protect. Because if William had known everything, if he had known how close Charlotte had come to being humiliated by subtle sabotage, lighting tricks, scripted stumbles, whispers from Camilla's loyal circle, it might have changed the way he saw that moment. Worse, it might have changed the way Charlotte saw herself. Anne refused to let that happen, so she carried the truth alone. Her diary entry that night was steady and firm. "I chose silence, not as weakness, but as a gift. A gift not only to Charlotte, but to William. A shield he never even knew he needed." Here's where Anne's silence became the shield William never knew Charlotte needed. Stay with us to see how it unfolds. How Anne protected Charlotte without a word. In Buckingham Palace, power often arrived with titles, trumpets, and flashing cameras. But not for Princess Anne. Her kind of power didn't need a stage or spotlight. It moved in silence, made choices without noise, and protected without permission. After the near sabotage of Princess Charlotte's royal gala debut in March 2025, Anne returned to her quarters and documented the experience in her diary, not for praise, but to remember the war she fought where no one else was looking. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her influence had always worked behind the scenes, measured, deliberate, and razor-sharp. She didn't send out royal memos or launch official inquiries after discovering the plot engineered from within Camilla's trusted circle. Instead, she made quiet staffing adjustments. One aide found themselves reassigned to a Commonwealth embassy in Canada. Another was rotated to an administrative desk far from decision-making. There were no formal warnings, no dramatic farewells. Anne's approach left no trail, only results. She called it a surgical correction in her diary. And like a skilled surgeon, she operated with care. No damage left behind, no scar to point to. Charlotte's big moment had been restored, preserved, and protected before she ever knew it was at risk. Anne didn't do it for glory. She did it because someone had to. Anne had always believed the strongest warriors wore the quietest armor. She had lived decades in royal service without feeding into spectacle or rivalry. And now, once again, she had held up the monarchy, not with grand speeches or sweeping declarations, but with calm precision. But what disturbed her most wasn't the sabotage. It was the stakes. The gala wasn't just another charming appearance for Charlotte. It was her formal step onto the world stage, a signal to Britain and beyond that the next generation of royals wasn't just waiting. They were ready. Cameras from across Europe, Asia, and the United States had been pointed directly at her. Diplomats and dignitaries filled the Royal Opera House, eager to assess not just what Charlotte said, but how she said it. And Camilla's circle had tried to take that from her, not with an obvious scandal, but with little cracks meant to rattle Charlotte's confidence. An altered speech here, a lighting cue there. Anne had written, "This wasn't sabotage by force. It was sabotage by a shadow." She understood the game all too well. Anne had seen it during Diana's rise, how power behind the palace walls didn't always flow through titles. Sometimes it flowed through whispers, backdoor alliances, and fear of change. Her diary captured it with chilling clarity. There were now two visions growing inside the monarchy. One clinging to the past, tied to Camilla's way of keeping control. The other, hopeful and future-focused, aligned with Charlotte's strength, presence, and potential. This wasn't about one gala. It was about the direction of the crown. Anne wasn't surprised by the faction forming, but she was watching closely. She didn't name names publicly, but in her pages, she recorded it all. This wasn't a family dispute. It was the early signs of a power shift. And while the public cheered Charlotte's flawless night, Anne knew the truth. The palace wasn't at war, but someone had drawn the first line. And this is how a flawless royal night masked the first move in a silent palace war. Stay glued to uncover more. The diary no one knew existed. March 2025. The palace halls were quiet again, but Princess Anne knew better. Silence didn't mean peace. Not here. Not after what had almost happened. She sat alone by the fire, the soft ticking of the mantel clock echoing through the stillness of her private sitting room. In her lap was the diary. Its spine worn, its corners frayed from decades of entries. It wasn't just paper, it was her memory. Her proof, her anchor in a place where truth often came second to presentation. She opened it gently, the pages fluttering like a familiar whisper, and began to write. Charlotte had been the target this time. Anne documented everything. The edits made to the speech, the lighting instructions mysteriously changed, and the subtle reroutes on stage plans. But she didn't record it as gossip or anger. She recorded it as evidence. Names, dates, patterns, calm, clinical. Like a detective building a case. This was no accident. It was a campaign. One crafted quietly by those who didn't want Charlotte to fail loudly, just enough to make her stumble. In her notes, Anne returned to an old line she'd once written years earlier during Catherine's first public trial. This institution protects its image more than it protects its own. That truth had never felt sharper. The palace, outwardly united, was splitting behind closed doors. She saw the lines forming clearly now. On one side, loyalists to Camilla, polished, practiced, and political. On the other hand, Charlotte's growing potential, backed quietly by Catherine's grace and William's vision. And between them, the throne, timeless, but not untouched. Anne had seen this game before. It was the same game that had broken Diana, the same one that had cornered Charles, exposed his weakest hours, and scattered trusted staff into bitter rivalries. Nothing in the palace happened by accident. Everything was strategy, even kindness, especially sabotage. She stared at the last sentence she'd written, fingers hovering above the ink. Then she looked toward the fire. For a moment, the thought came. Burn the book. Destroy the truth before it ever had a chance to wound. But she couldn't. Not because she needed the record. Because the truth, once written, gains weight. It becomes a witness. The thought of Charlotte one day finding the diary chilled her. What would she think? Reading all this, would it make her stronger? Or shake her trust in everything she believed she'd earned? Would she wonder if every praise had been protection, every triumph a setup? Anne closed the book softly and turned the key in the lock. She didn't hide it out of secrecy. She did it out of mercy. Down the corridor, the palace remained still, but Anne knew better. The factions were sharpening their tools. This time, the target had been Charlotte. Next time, it could be someone else entirely. William didn't know. He never would, not because she doubted him, but because she believed in him. He would burn the walls down to shield his daughter, but the fire wouldn't just touch the guilty. It would stain Charlotte's win. Anne would carry that weight. It was her place. Always had been. Before bed, she added one last line. They will remember her smile, but I will remember why it stayed. So what do you think Anne was really protecting? Charlotte's future or the monarchy's secrets? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more royal revelations.